a conversation. And so at the start of it, they say, want to see a movie and get popcorn. The other person says, well, I don't know, I have this rule, see? I only go to a movie if it satisfies 3 basic requirements. 1, it has to have at least 2 women in it, who 2, talk to each other about 3, something besides a man. They kind of walk along in silence. Pretty strict, but a good idea. No kidding. Last movie I was able to see was Alien. The 2 women in it talk to each other about the monster. Dejected looking, sort of walk along. Want to go to my house and make popcorn? Now you're talking. All right. So that's where this starts, right? And it's really a way of saying, hey, what kinds of stories do we tell around gender? Because we often fall into a habit where even as we try and expand our storytelling, right, and thinking about the structures of power that we tell those stories within, right? Even as we say, hey, we know we focused our storytelling on the people who are set in power, right? Let's tell some stories about folks who have less power in the world or have been out of power. That storytelling still regularly talks about their relationship to people in power, right? That we are still gonna center folks, the powerful in some way, right? And that's what they're trying to get at is, can we break that? Can we start to tell those stories differently? What happens when we don't tell stories across power spectrums, right? But we tell stories that sit outside of it, right? Where we consciously take account of that spectrum and then try and tell a story that looks in a different direction, right? And so the Bechdel test is something that gets applied to movies, to books, to television shows all the time, right? And it really does look and think about gender. But we could think about it as well with other power spectrums, right? And because we tell stories just like those movies and just like those books, right? We could start to apply it to our stories too, right? And start to say, hey, where could we think about telling our stories a little bit differently? Where do we fall into that trap of just telling stories across power spectrums and not break out of that and try and show the full humanity of people and access their full humanity in telling in these different ways? So my challenge for you is thinking about a power spectrum that is a part of one of the sites that you are connected with. And Stefano, you have a site. Sarah and Shiori, use any site you would like of the many that you are connected to and think about in the world. Here's the little prompt that I have for you, right? At my site, I can tell a story where 2 named blank talk to each other about something other than blank. Right? And as you think about this, right, we've kind of got this positionality of story that we're including in there. And then we've got the idea of the naming is also, again, goes to this fullness of humanity. So I would encourage you to think about that for a second and say, what's a story you might tell? Take another 30 seconds, and then when then we'll maybe share. All right. Anybody have ideas? Thoughts occurring to you? How you might do this at your site?
I was thinking about a site that I'm working with who is considering opening up kind of what they would consider their back of the house spaces. It's a very wealthy family's historic estate. And it just made me think about how many times we tell stories with of kind of a service class is still centered in, right, the wealthy elite, right? So especially this kind of upstairs, downstairs tour structure that has happened in a lot of historic sites, this idea that, oh, we're telling their stories, but we're still telling their stories through the lens of how they served the wealthy elite, not in the rest of their life. So it just made me think about two of the named individuals in that space and how all of the conversations around the interpretation is still centering around, their the accommodations they make for the wealthy family they serve, rather than their life outside of the house.
Fascinating. Stefano or Shiori?
Well, I'm still thinking, but
okay.
Yeah, on this, what Sarah said, what I was also thinking is that, yeah, the survivors we talk about, they didn't belong to to a class of powerful people. Most of them are illiterate. They were, of course, now it's different, but back then they were families of illiterate people who usually were not the owners of the land that they were cultivating. They were all farmers. And that's not also what you usually find in Italian history manuals and books nowadays in schools. It's not the point of view that is the most represented. Also, the fact that many of them didn't speak Italian, and this is something that we represent. I mean, comparatively, we represent much less in the stories that we tell. People who had a higher level of education, because also statistically in the area of my site, there were few of them. So I think it reflects the social composition of the area. And in this respect, it offers a point of view about people who are usually underrepresented. But from another point of view, that's what I was thinking, like, in terms of roles, so maybe it's a different topic and feel free to leave it there, but I was thinking, I like the fact that sometimes we tell stories about two survivors talking to each other about something that is not the massacre. Because in this way, they are not just in this role of, they are people who experience this, but they are people, you know, with life, with a lot of other things. They are not one dimension.
I think that's exactly what I was thinking about for you all, right? Is that kind of, as you're saying, that one dimensionality that comes with being linked to being a victim, being a survivor, right? And the kind of, though that may not be a larger systemic power structure, though it certainly existed for those moments, right? That they're trapped in that one relationship and that one understanding of who they are. And this allows for that complexity of narrative. But you only get that when you intentionally try and pair those people and have them talk about something other than being that survivor. Yeah, it's a really good, nice. Hi, Mark, thanks for joining. You came in the middle of a discussion after we had started to break a few things down, starting to think about how we could tell stories that are not just about somebody who is has less power towards somebody with greater power, but as Stefano was just saying, how we can break out of that sort of one-dimensional aspect of people's lives. Yeah. Shiori, did you have anything?
Well, I went for kind of the trite answer because we have a client that was heavily politically active for women's rights, and immediately the thought is like women banding together to participate, but the inherent part of their entire organization and their museum and their work is directly related to how they were inferior to men, how their role in society was both a subject of gender, like gender norms, and then economic kind of hierarchies. And so then I was like, well, that doesn't really work, because so much of their focus is about how these women got together to fight that. And so I don't know if it almost seems as if not talking about that dynamic wouldn't meet the expectations of like this organization's mission. But then at the same time, a huge part of their mission is like women can exist without, or should exist without, the oppression of gender dictating their lives. And so I don't know, I'm kind of sitting with that weird tension right now, and I don't know if I can fully articulate a better answer at the moment.
It makes me think of the and Sherry, I'm sure in DC you've been and seen the Americans exhibit at NMAI. Because what was interesting about that work, and Stefano, if you haven't seen it, it's a native oriented voice, but it was about flipping the narrative from telling stories through the eye of being an oppressed people, right, or being survivors, to saying, no, like, you're still talking about us and we still have power, and almost irrelevant of what you did to us, like, you define yourselves by us. The most unique thing about the United States are Native and Indigenous voices. So unique that you named all your places after us, like so unique that you put us on all your advertising. And I like the shifting of that power dynamic. It feels right to what you're talking about, Shiori, right? There's something there that's interesting to think about.
I also think about the way that those things don't feel unlinked, right? Finding those spaces where that power dynamic is not part of it is an intentional kind of survival and strategy that people in those groups create. And I'm thinking about that across like multiple kinds of spaces, right, and multiple kinds of dynamics. But people are regularly needing to carve those spaces apart. So I'm not convinced that, it's an interesting place that you're starting to think there. And another way that I would have seen people start to wrestle with something similar, or another challenge of that, is that when a space is really focused around one kind of power dynamic, the challenge of making space for other power dynamics to be a part of that too, right? And the kind of intersectionality of folks' lives. And thinking about, are there other kinds of stories that it makes sense to try and carve that out for? And again, to see that kind of fullness of human life. Yeah. Okay. We'll try and keep these short. So I just want to share one last idea with you that is related to this. And that's that very often when we ask people to start thinking in this way, right? And it's not the only story we want to tell, right? Because absolutely, as Shiori is saying, like, we got to tell the stories about the contestation of those power structures, of the resistance to oppression. Like, those matter too. But as we add these in, right, and the kind of the depth that brings, very often it means that we start to run into a problem with sources, because the same power structures that are shaping our the way our stories have been crafted have also likely shaped the sources that we have. Right? They shape what goes into the archives. They shape the focus and the bias of the material in the archives. And so then when we go to that, we say, oh, look, but we've got all this evidence about some of the people and much less of the evidence about these other folks. I don't know the specifics of the project you're working on, Sarah, but so often in that case, like we know a lot more about the people who own the house than the people who worked in the back of the house. So how do we actually tell those stories? Like, what do we do? And that is an idea there. We start to think about an idea called reading against the grain, right? Which is to say, like, so this image, right, you look at it and you can kind of flip your eyes between the vase in the white space or the faces in the black space. You know, you can kind of go back and forth. We often use it to talk about bias or the way we have a particular perception of the world, but I find this a really interesting image for thinking about reading against the grain, right? And if you see the face, what is it about the outline of the face that actually tells you about that vase there, and vice versa? And so often what reading against the grain is about going back to look at our content again and saying, what did we miss the first time? Because we were kind of centering a story in one way. And so when we think about it, when we say, hey, I want to look for these person-to-person connections that are outside of this power dynamic, how can I start filling that in and using the edges and the outlines of the information I have, kind of reimagining those documents and what they could tell to help us do that. So this storytelling process, the Bechdel test, is not just a one-stop, hey, let's put that just on the storytelling side. It often requires a degree of kind of background work too, to start to rethink what we count as our sources and how we think through our content there. All right. And those are kind of the 2 quick points for us to just start thinking about here. You know, as we try and keep our webinar short today, anything on people's minds at the end as you're thinking about this, as you're thinking about kind of telling a different angle on stories? Anything you're still sitting with here?
I think of Bechdel's kind of autobiography Fun Home, which was a graphic novel that was about her and also her dad and their relationship. And in reading it, I think you realize that there's so much like self-discovery in her creation, family reflection. And so I think when I think about like reading against the grain and the process that is both, or I guess what I'm saying is that there's a personal process to that, I think. And like, I don't know, I think when we talk about the limitations of source material, one of the biggest things we can do now is encourage documentation or storytelling, whatever that looks like, if it's oral histories, if it's creating graphic novels, or however that looks, that the storytelling part of things don't always have to be the archived literature or archived photographs. They can manifest in different ways, and the processes of weeding through those different media can be just as, I think, exposing or informative. But it is still hard when there is a limit, when you look at the timeline of storytelling and history, that the access is, you know, we can't reach things from hundreds of years ago the way that we could start creating the material now. So that's kind of what I think of.
And it gives us new questions to ask in that oral history. So often we do oral history with somebody because, hey, you were a leader in this struggle, right? You were a person who was right, head of the resistance at this, right? And so giving them, knowing that we want to ask those questions both about the resistance, but also about the spaces outside of that, helps us build those richer archives too. Yeah, so I hadn't thought about it that way, but I love that idea of being able to then take it into how we are actively creating the our materials as well. Well, great. Well, it's good to see you all. Thanks for hanging out for a few minutes. And we'll see everybody next week. Oh, I have a slide of our upcoming things. So let's look at that because there's too many. I never remember them. All right. October 8th, we're doing Mourning in the Distance, Grief and Memorialization. October 14th, Democracy. We're thinking about it. We're trying to pull a couple of things together. We're trying to get some scenario planning for museums around the election. Not exactly sure where things are going to land. We're trying to make stuff happen fast. One of the other great things to look for over the next couple of months for coalition members, right, is that all of our workshops, regional workshops, have gone digital this year. As opposed to people meeting in person, they are happening digitally. That means it's really easy to jump in and spend some time with folks from other regions of the world. Not the whole workshop will be open, but a chunk of it will be. So we're going to have some things coming live from the Middle East and North Africa regional meeting. And so look for those if you want to be kind of broadening your international connections, right? And lots of good stuff coming. TJ commissions, right? Repatriation, more good stuff coming this fall. All right, cool. We'll see you all on one of those.